Alright guys, welcome back to the Pocket Mads channel. It's Maddie here. Today we're going to be talking about the best decks to play in the current metagame for Pokemon Pocket. We're going into the second week of this new Pulsing Aura B3 season. Definitely some progressions going on, but I do think the metagame is starting to settle down a little bit. A couple of things to touch on before we get into the list here. The first one is that, of course, ranked isn't out yet. However, online tournaments are still, kicking. There's still a lot of them going on. So if you want to compete in an online tournament this weekend, I know it's Mother's Day, but if you are interested, go and register for PMPT number 30. Amazing Aura, $100 in the prize pool this weekend. It's going to be really fun. We're going to stream it as we always do on the channel, and it's going to be a great place to come and compete. I really think that the results this weekend are going to be very important for, understanding the metagame as we move into the next ranked season, which should start sometime, I believe, next week. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of meta developments that are happening right now, which is sort of prompting the list of decks that we're going to be highlighting in today's video. The number one thing that I want to talk about is the Bad Dreams sort of sleep archetypes, the sleep scam stuff that everybody's very familiar with at this point. It dominated all last season. It was very prominent early this season, but I think we're seeing definitely a shift away from that a little bit. So what ended up happening was that, the sleep stuff found, its position early on this season with some of the new archetypes. Last season, it was seeing play mostly with Altaria. So Mega Altaria was seeing play with Darkai and Igglybuff. And then that deck list got kind of taken over by a new deck list early this season, which was Mega Lucario. And Mega Lucario kind of took over for as kind of like a home for the Bad Dreams Igglybuff Darkrai combo. That was by far the most successful deck early on the season. Still a very strong deck list, but what we're seeing is definitely more counterplay to the sleep stuff in general. A lot more Ogerpons flying around, a lot more decks that can just in general deal with the Bad Dream stuff a little bit more, easily. And then also what we're seeing as well, and we're going to highlight in today's video, is basically this sort of new way to play Lucario, which is a very simple, standardized version of Lucario that I think a lot more people are playing and has been very successful so far. The other development here that we're going to talk about at the end of the video is Zoroark. So Hydreigon really kind of taking a back seat. Throughout this week, particularly some of these tournaments, more Zoroark seeing play than Hydreigon. Zoroark winning a few tournaments, having overall, I would say, even a better average win rate than Hydreigon throughout some of the tournaments this week. So that's going to be kind of the two main progressions. So that being said, that's the context for our list of decks that we're going to talk about this week. The first one, though, is going to be Sceptile. So I've kind of brought back up, I believe it's pretty much the same deck list that won PMPT number 29 last weekend. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can play Sceptile. I still think that this is a very nice all-around version of the deck list. It's got a lot of different things going for it. Double Fragrant Forest continues to be a massive advantage for all grass-type decks, but specifically Mega Sceptile. It allows you to get around Chingling item lock so that, of course, you can play your stadium, but, you can't play Pokeball when you're in item lock. So we can still get our basics down and our deck can kind of still flow as normally intended. We are going to still get locked out of, using Rare Candy because of Chinglings, but we are playing one Grovyle, which also has some secondary uses, being able to hit for 50 damage on any one of your opponent's Pokemon. Playing Pheromosa, playing Kartana, really strong grass leadoff Pokemon that are always going to be really nice into Dark-type decks because weakness is a little bit more important early in the game when Pokemon have less HP. So against things like Zoroark, the basic version Zorua, which has 6 HP, or Dinos and Hydreigon. Those are 60 HP weak grass type weak to grass Pokemon. So they're going to be pretty heavily affected by things like Pheromosa and Kartana. Chingling also going to be really useful in a variety of different scenarios. So this is a really consistent deck. I think Sceptile has proven to be a top tier meta strategy this season. I think on our tier list Tuesday, we kept it high A tier. We'll have to see if it pops off again this weekend. If it wins for a second week in a row, then, the results are just sort of going to be undeniable. I would be pretty surprised if Sceptile ended up winning again, but I'm also really curious to see what the most played decks are this weekend. I think Lucario and Zoroark are going to rise and play pretty prominently. So I think the meta share in this weekend's tournament and the decks that people play are going to be actually a lot different than they were last weekend. So it'll be really interesting to take a look at that. But anyway, again, you can play Sceptile a lot of different ways. You can play it with Ogerpon if you wanted to really counter the sleep decks. But like I said, not many decks playing Sleep. You could play, some extra healing and Leaf Capes to kind of get above, sort of some 2-hit KO thresholds throughout the metagame. However, what we're seeing right now is one of the main competitors being Lucario. It's going to be really difficult to be outside of 2-hit KO range. As long as you're outside of 1-hit KO range, which you are typically anyway, with 210 HP, you're going to be okay. One thing about Sceptile, though, is that it has been struggling with the new version of Altaria that people are playing, which is Gourgiest, for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about. I think that is definitely a top-tier deck. I still like Sceptile. I'm still feeling pretty confident about that high A-tier placement. We'll see how it performs this weekend. Next up is going to be Suicune. I think Suicune kind of rose back up a little bit this week. I think that for, whatever the reason, Suicune really didn't see a lot of play in week 1, and it's also not something that I think will really ever dominate the metagame again unless somehow something happens that really opens up position for Suicune. Magnezone still seeing a lot of play. Things like Lucario and Sceptile can at least hold their own into Suicune. So I still think that Suicune is a good deck, and it's seen more play this week than it did last week, and its win rates are actually pretty impressive. So, maybe a little bit of an over-exaggeration about, how the metagame was shifting early on this season. Say what you will, this is still going to be a semi-top tier deck list. I don't know if it will rise back up in popularity as much as it was the past few seasons, but I'm still feeling right now that given the results and the amount of people that have played it this week, and how many people have done well playing Suicune and Baxcalibur, that I have to recommend it to you guys as one of these sort of top 7, top 8 decks in the metagame right now. I do think it has a position. Once more people play it, maybe after this weekend, we'll see how it performs. I would like to kind of really detail the matchup spreads for this deck list and really understand where Suicune's struggling this season, because historically, it's really been a deck that can do well into Hydreigon and hold its own across other decks in the metagame, but struggle, of course, into some of the lightning stuff. And I think that's probably still the position that it's in right now. Honestly, if Magnezone and Oricorio with the new Magnezone EX really ends up being kind of like a top deck this season throughout the rest of the season, I don't know if Suicune will ever really break into that like top 5 threshold. But again, I wanted to highlight it because this week it has been doing somewhat well. It's got an uptick in play, and its win rates have been honestly really decent. So we all know this is a strong deck list. I don't really have too much else to say about it. It's been a little while since these Suicune decks have been updated. We did get Inteleon in Pulsing Aura, but I think most people are still on the Baxcalibur Qianpao train. Some people try to play Greninja early this season. Greninja Suicune really just not doing that well. So I think that for now, it's still Baxcalibur and Qianpao, kind of just as we knew it the last few seasons. Nothing really new to come to this deck list. I still think it's totally fine. And like I said, it performed somewhat well this week, so had to include it in today's video. Now, one of the biggest rises this week, and I kind of mentioned it last week, one of the things that I am most scared about throughout this entire season, we really don't know. We're on the verge, right? Like the first week isn't really that important in most scenarios because it's not a real definition of what the metagame will end up looking like. But what the first week of the metagame does is it gives us hints. It gives us little bits of information that we can kind of see and maybe predict, how those things are going to play out towards the end of the season. Of course, Sceptile winning week 1, it was like, okay, Sceptile's here. It's a legitimate deck. I haven't fully bought into it being like the top deck of the metagame. But one of the things that stood out to me in that first week and last weekend was going to be the Lucky Egg Chingling combination. And I've talked about this, I think, several times. This deck list is absolutely ridiculous, and it does scare me. Double Research, double Copycat, double Pokeball, double Lucky Egg on Chingling lock, item lock, drawing into rare candy Greninjas with Mega Altaria on the back line to finish games. This deck list, Altaria Greninja that is, has always been perhaps the strongest deck in the game in terms of like top tier potential. You got to understand, theoretically speaking, and it does happen sometimes. Theoretically speaking, you can go turn 2, double Greninja, Mega Altaria, attacking for 130, that's 170 total damage, and have Cyrus in your hand, and the game's over. Like, this deck list has that ability to do that. Now, that's never really been something that happens very often. This deck list has always struggled in the games where even on turn 3 and turn 4, it just doesn't really get up and running. Now, with Lucky Egg and Chingling, it just does it way more often. So instead of this being like a true high roll type deck, it honestly feels like a somewhat consistent tempo deck that is incredibly strong in the mid to late game. Lucky Egg going to draw a ton of cards. Chingling item lock still going to be very, very valuable in the metagame. And then now on turn 3, at the very latest, I guess turn 4, but most of the time on turn 3, sometimes turn 2, pretty often on turn 2, you're going to have to deal with Altaria and Greninja. The thing about this deck list, which does keep it in check, is the fact that we only have 20 cards in our deck. So if we are going to be playing double Lucky Egg with Chingling, as you see, what people have done is cut one Mega Altaria and 1 Cyrus. Now, I don't think the Mega Altaria part is really that big of a deal. It's pretty likely that you're going to draw it with all of the draw support in this game by turn 2 or turn 3 when you would use Mega Altaria. But the 1 Cyrus I do think is a somewhat big deal because now your opponent can only Cyrus 1 time throughout a game. And typically, they would need maybe more than 1 Cyrus to win. Now, that's not actually technically the case, though, because so many Mega Pokemon decks see play that all you really have to do is come into Altaria, hit, or ping with Greninja a couple times, and then Cyrus just that 1 Mega, and then you win the game. This is a deck that's going to punish, other Mega decks that don't have a lot of HP that are going to kind of fall in range. Things like Mega Absol, right? So you're just not really going to be that safe when it comes to benching Mega Pokemon against Mega Altaria. This is definitely, in my estimation, going to be a pretty top deck of the metagame. It has been performing well, has had a pretty solid win rate. It's ticking up in popularity. Again, it does terrify me, quite frankly, that we're going to have to deal with Chingling, Lock, Lucky Egg, high roll decks because, that's kind of where things are kind of going to me. This package here feels a little bit even more toxic than like the Bad Dream stuff because at least you have a counterplay to Bad Dreams, right? That's what people like. I've heard so many times from people that, and it's a really big deal. And Igglybuff Darkrai is a really strong combination. There are some times that you can't counterplay it. Like if they go first, lead Igglybuff and get double Darkrai down, of course, it's going to be really strong. But that doesn't happen nearly as much as you think. Having Chingling and Lucky Egg there's literally nothing that you can do other than maybe have like a Field Blow in your deck or a Guzma to get rid of Lucky Egg. But if you look at the decks in the metagame, not many people are playing Field Blower or Tool Discard. You know what I mean? So basically, and there's no way to get around Chingling item lock, quite frankly. It's still the strongest effect in the game. I've been telling people this for so long. Chingling is still one of the most impressive and valuable Pokemon in the game just because item lock can win you the game. Like, just outright. Like, if your opponent doesn't draw the right cards and they can't play Pokeballs, the game will end. You will win. So there is sort of that variance with Chingling. It always gives it the opportunity to win the game. And there's just really no counterplay to this unless you are playing like Field Blower and you can draw into it or whatnot. It's a very, very strong strategy. We had to highlight this deck list because it's been doing very well. And something, quite frankly, I am afraid of. So, there we go. Altaria's been upgraded. Altaria Greninja upgraded for some reason. It is what it is. Next up is going to be this Lucario deck that I mentioned to you guys. This is, I think, becoming the most popular version of Lucario. I don't want to count out Bad Dreams Lucario because it is still strong. I think that if Sleep counterplay with Ogerpon and PCL, falls back out of contention, then I think that, the Bad Dreams version can come back and still be a top tier deck because it is still incredibly strong. The one thing to note about Mega Lucario is it is one of the strongest Pokemon in the game, now with access to Karina and Arena of Antiquity. This whole combo is really nice. Now, the breakpoints are like really specific, and I do think there's things in the metagame that people can do but aren't really doing right now to counter Lucario. So if Lucario does end up being perhaps like the strongest deck in the game, that could be, or like the most played deck, then it could be something that we have to look at right in the future. You could run like a Giant Cape, or you could run like Indeedee to keep your active Pokemon's HP up a little bit. Like there's a lot of things you can do to kind of defeat Lucario or counterplay a strategy like this. But currently in the metagame, having Hitmontop come in and just start hitting the active and a bench Pokemon for 20 turn after turn after turn, sometimes it just adds up. It's Hitmontop and same with Pheromosa. These are Pokemon that are just way better than you might think at first glance because all of a sudden, it's turn 2, turn 3, and you got 60 HP gone from your active, 60 gone from your bench Pokemon. Your baby Pokemon aren't really safe. It's a really strong leadoff. Like any deck that has these Pokemon, which basically I think only is Hitmontop and Pheromosa, is a really big advantage. And we're seeing that across, fighting and grass type decks now. They're playing Pheromosa and they're playing Hitmontop because they are such valuable cards. But the thing about Mega Lucario with Karina and Arena of Antiquity is that it can hit for 190 damage. And like, sure, there's other things in the game that can do that, but not many. Like we're kind of just talking about like Charizard, I think. There might be like something else. But 190 is a really good number. Like you KO other Mega Lucarios, you KO Mega Altaria. You can KO Sceptile if you can get some chip damage on the board. So Mega Lucario is very scary because the breakpoints are unique. And I think that the buffs to the fighting archetype really are carrying Mega Lucario. And I do think that this is probably the best fighting type deck that we've had in a very, very long time. And I mean like a true fighting type deck. Sleep Lucario is right up there. But yeah, I think we're just going to have to deal with the fact that Mega Lucario is really impressive. And there's going to be so many situations where you just don't have a way to win against a Mega Lucario that's ready to hit you for enough damage. Reach and being able to just KO Pokemon is always going to be the most valuable thing in Pokemon Pocket, right? Like if you can KO a Pokemon, you're probably going to win. You know, if you can't, then you're going to have to wait another turn, and Lucario can kind of do what not many other Pokemon in the game do, which is one-hit KO, you know, 2-3 prize Pokemon quite easily. So yeah, I think that this is kind of perhaps the number one deck currently. It's hard to really say. I don't know if it's the most played deck, but again, if something like this wins this weekend, it could very easily tip this over the edge. There's just not many contending decks to Mega Lucario other than other versions of Mega Lucario. You know what I mean? So that's the advantage that Lucario has in the metagame, is that there's nothing really here to knock it off its pedestal. Like if it does end up being the top deck of the metagame, that's what it is. Like there's nothing really comparable that we have to it. So yeah, I think that this is something I would recommend currently right now. Seeing a lot of play, very successful. I think it might have won a couple of tournaments this week. Just a really good deck all around. Now, next up, which I did put in S tier on Tuesday, is Magnezone Oricorio. This deck list is doing exactly what we all expected it to do, and it does it just as good as we ever thought it would. I think, you know, it's got everything going for it, to be honest. Like, this is the deck list that, you know, by the end of the season, when you take a look at every tournament and every placement, might be the most successful deck overall. Historically, and this seems like a crazy thing to say, but like if you go back and you check the data, the most successful deck in PMPT tournament history, and we've done 30 of them, is Magnezone Oricorio in whatever iteration that it's been every season. It's won more tournaments, it's placed higher, it's had a higher average win rate than any other deck throughout the history of PMPT. Now, again, in ranked, it's a bit different, but in tournament play, like, you gotta understand Magnezone Oricorio is always going to be a strong choice. What's interesting about this deck list this season is that it's kind of, you know, approaching the threshold of like being one of the most played decks, but also it probably won't cross that threshold. That's the thing about Oricorio, is that it's always prominent. People are always playing it. It's always successful, but it's never seeing that much play. You know, and you know, for good reason. I don't think that many people really want to play Oricorio on ranked ladder or in tournaments. But enough people do to where it's always prominent enough. And I think that's the position that Oricorio deserves to be in. A very important card to the metagame. Magnezone, I just think that they can't help themselves. The Pokemon Pocket devs can't help themselves but keep Magnezone alive for one reason or another, and it'll continue to be a relevant Pokemon probably until we're all dead. And Pokemon Pocket's been around for 40 years. I don't know how they're gonna do it, but I don't know where we go from here. Maybe they just give us a maybe they invent Mega Magnezone for Pokemon Pocket. Who knows? But yeah, nothing else to really say here. It got second place at our tournament this past weekend. Continues to have good placements and high win rates across all tournaments. Sees a decent amount of play, but not nearly as much as some of the other decks on this tier list. But you know, it's successful, so that's why we mention it. And I'm always going to recommend this deck list because I think it's important that Oricorio does see play in the metagame. Some people might not like fully agree with me on that, but if you go back and you look at every single metagame that people have thought is a good metagame since Oricorio came out, all of the good metagames have been Oricorio being relevant. Like if Oricorio isn't relevant, then it's just not a healthy metagame, right? Because that's just what Oricorio does. Luckily, right now, Hydreigon isn't the most played deck. It's not super dominant. Fighting is somewhat common in the metagame, right? Because of Lucario. So that's going to be its own thing that maybe helps keep Magnezone in check a little bit. Historically, grass-type decks have done good into Oricorio, so I don't really know exactly how Sceptile is doing. It's not really a traditional type of grass deck. It's not like a sustain healing grass deck, but theoretically, it should be doing somewhat well into Oricorio as well. So I still think this is going to be a really strong choice moving forward. So, you know, that's my Magnezone Oricorio update. You're going to see this deck list or whatever the more recent version of this deck is on every single meta update and deck list video on this channel. Like, you just will. Like, I don't know if people have realized it yet. I don't think I've ever really not included Magnezone Oricorio. Maybe, well, no, I think last season, like, Oricorio found its home in Manectric a little bit. But again, I don't, you know, it is what it is. This is a top tier deck. It really is. All right, let's talk about the two decks that I feel probably the most strongly about right now going into the season. The first one, going into this weekend rather, the first one is going to be Gourgiest Altaria. This, I think, has been the on average, the highest win rate deck in the metagame this week. Probably the most successful deck right now, perhaps the best deck. We did put this in S tier. The writing was on the wall a little bit. When I kind of looked into this deck list and I looked into its matchup spreads and its consistency, I was like, oh, okay, so like this really is like a really, really high top tier deck in the game right now. And I think it is, and it still is, and it'll probably continue to be. I think that with Lucario being prominent in the metagame, with Oricorio being prominent in the metagame, Gourgiest continues to be just such a solid card. This is such a good card. Like, just for like the very standard fact that it's a stage 1 Pokemon, single energy attack cost with 110 HP, does 70 damage. Like, it's just a good card. And now we're hitting fighting type Pokemon for weakness like Hitmontop, taking the KO, which is a really big deal. We can 1-hit KO Oricorio. This deck list doesn't really have to worry about Chingling item lock, and it also plays Chingling item lock. It's a really, really good deck list, guys. Training area rather, is kind of a stadium that doesn't see any play other than in this strategy, which is kind of crazy. But I guess other decks just don't really need it as much. It is going to boost Gourgeist and Altaria's damage. We've got bench damage with Jirachi. We have a Sabrina, a Cyrus, and we got Mars, guys. All right, quick tangent here. Hand Disruption is worth playing. I don't know when or why this happened, but at some point people stopped playing Hand Disruption, particularly Mars, but also Red Card. People just don't play these cards anymore, and maybe it's because people stopped playing Chingling for a little bit, but trust me, like when you're playing Chingling, double Chingling in Mars, or just playing any deck like this, playing multiple single prize Pokemon, Mars is such a good card. It is, hand advantage and card advantage is always going to be like the most like telltale sign of whether or not you're going to win a game or not. If you have 4 cards in your deck and your opponent has 11, you're probably going to win the game. And the number one way to do that is to play things like Chingling Lock and Mars. So I think that that's just one of the biggest outliers about this deck list is it's like, I'm playing Chingling and I'm playing Mars, and that's going to be a big advantage. Another big aspect of this deck list and Altaria, which we don't see as much in maybe other decks, Magnezone, we do see it, is Lycia. Lycia is still one of the more underrated things in the entire game. If you can play a deck with 50 HP basic Pokemon or baby Pokemon or both, as we see in this deck list, Lycia is such an incredible card. It's basically a draw 2 in the early game. If you have Lycia, it gives you so much good pacing, consistency for your deck. I really, really think this deck kind of has it all going for it right now. And I think it's a really good place for Altaria. I know we talked about the Greninja version. There's still the Bad Dreams, Darkrai, Altaria, deck list. But at the end of the day, this to me is really what Altaria kind of should be. Which is like, kind of like a psychic type toolbox deck playing, varying different Pokemon that all kind of fit a good role. Really consistent, really, really nice in the mid game, in the early game. And, it's not as strong late game as some other decks, but its mid game potential is absolutely through the roof. I still think Altaria is a top tier deck in the metagame. And this might be the #1 deck. Coincidentally, this might be the best deck in the game. So, if this wins this weekend, no one should be surprised. Shout out to Chingling, shout out to Mars. Absolute goats. Okay, lastly, let's talk about Zoroark. We're gonna go on like a meta manipulation tirade right now. I'm gonna just sit here and I'm gonna tell you that, on Tuesday when we were doing the tier list, and even on this past weekend when we were doing Meta Monday and stuff, I definitely wanted to highlight Zoroark's success because it has been one of the more successful decks so far this season. A really pleasant surprise. I never thought. If you were to tell me that a new dark type Pokemon were to be released, that would be like very similar to Hydreigon in terms of the decks that we played and how we build a deck with it, and it would actually be more popular and more successful than Hydreigon this past season, I would not have believed you. I just wouldn't have. I would have been like, there's no way. But coincidentally, that's where we're at right now, and I think that as we're seeing more and more Chingling in the metagame, which is a good thing, by the way, as long as we're seeing more Chingling, I think that Zoroark will have a better position in the metagame than Hydreigon, and that's what we've seen this week. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, Hydreigon's going to fall away this weekend and Zoroark is going to win. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but given the results throughout this past week, what we're seeing, the win rates, everything, Zoroark has outperformed Hydreigon in this past week, basically. And it is, in fact, to me, like the biggest story right now, the biggest deck, perhaps, the best deck. Like if it's not Altaria or some of those other decks that we talked about today, like this is as good, as any of those other decks. It's right up there. Now, the difference with Zoroark compared to a lot of the other decks that we've talked about into this video is that it doesn't have any Pokemon that can deal like a ton of damage. So what's interesting about Zoroark is that it's an aggro card. It's an aggro deck. So you're hitting for 90 on turn 2, which is pretty good, but it's not like incredible, right? Like high roll decks can do, 130, like Hydreigon hits 130 on turn 2 sometimes. But the difference here is that we're hyper consistent and we almost always are getting that 90 damage off on turn 2, which is a really big deal. You know what I mean? Like for the same reasons that Manectric was a top tier deck last season, I think that Zoroark really feels like kind of a dark type Manectric, but it has a lot of extra tools that are really valuable. Rocky Helmet further boosts the damage. Nightmare Aura Darkrai further boosting that damage that Zoroark can perform. You know, Bombardier proving to be an incredibly useful card. This deck list is playing 2 Bombardiers, which is crazy, but yet again, the effect does stack, so if you do lead Darkrai, it's kind of your only way to retreat out for free. And then, of course, we have Mega Absol to finish games. So there are going to be some matchups where this deck struggles. Of course, not something that we would really love to play, you know, into Sceptile, even into Hydreigon. I think this has a winning matchup, but its matchup spreads have really yet to be concretely defined this season. So it's really like, it's one of those things where after this weekend, I'll kind of make my own internal decision whether or not I think Zoroark deserves to be kind of considered a top tier deck and something to be taken more seriously than Hydreigon. But, you know, Hydreigon did make it to top 4 last weekend. It was the most played deck last weekend. It's fallen off since then. If Zoroark comes out and gets a, you know, a grand finals placement or, you know, just has a really high average win rate, then, you know, we're going to have to take this much more seriously. But for now, I really am surprised at Zoroark's success, and I honestly think it's just one of the best decks in the entire game right now. And you'll notice that we did not highlight Hydreigon in today's video, which is crazy. I'm just now realizing that I did not include a weekly wild card in this week's video, partly because I don't really think there is one. Like, it's hard to say, but I just don't really feel that strongly about anything that's not necessarily something we already know about. You know, like we didn't highlight Hydreigon in this video. We didn't highlight like any of the Bad Dreams decks, but those are, I wouldn't consider those wild card decks. Those are just, you know, in general strong decks that seem to be downtrending. So other than the decks that I mentioned in today's video, I don't really feel like anything stands out phenomenally here. I was expecting there to be something like that maybe popped up and was kind of, you know, kind of on the fringe going into this weekend, but there's not anything right now. If there is something that you think should have been the weekly wildcard today, comment it down below and let me know, but I'm sorry I do not have a weekly wildcard for you guys in today's video. But yeah, I'm really happy about this metagame. The progressions are not something I expected, and I think a lot of really quality cards came out this season, and it's really shaken up the metagame, and a lot of decks vying for, you know, that top tier meta contending spot. Luckily, the Pokemon Pocket seasons are so short that we probably won't really see any deck define itself as like the #1 deck for the rest of the season, which is a good thing. I don't think that anybody really wants tier 0 metagames in Pokemon Pocket because they're inherently a bit toxic, but a lot of really strong decks, and they're all different, you know? They're all different, which I think is really cool. Maybe Fire rises back up, you know, I don't know. We'll have to see. But anyway, guys, that's the video. Those are my top meta decks right now going into PMPT number 30 this weekend. Have a good Mother's Day. Shout out to all the mothers out there. And go check out the Champion Mads channel as well. We are also running a Pokemon Champion Singles Battles tournament on the weekends as well. $50 prize pool. Go check that out. Go check out the Champion Mads channel. Go register for PMPT number 30. Links all in the description down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. Thank you so much for watching. That's it. That's the video. All right, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. Bye.